2013 was a pretty notable year to be a computing enthusiast. Irrational Games and 2K gave us Bioshock Infinite, arguably a work of fine art about quantum physics and American exceptionalism, set in a bang-bang shooty-shooty flying city in 1912. Nvidia gave us the GTX 780 Ti, a flagship monster of a graphics card with performance that was head and shoulders above anything that had come before. And Cooler Master gave us their latest mini ITX case, dubbed the Elite 130. However, while that game is now in a dusty old collection of greatest hits, and that GPU is now a relic that belongs in a museum, this little black box is a survivor. Because while technology gets outdated pretty quickly in the computing world, this little case is still available brand new today. Why is that? It could be the case's ventilation, as there's an included 120mm fan that draws in air at the front and a removable supplementary slim 80mm fan that can be faced for intake or exhaust on the side. Or it might have something to do with its front connectivity, as it has audio jacks and 3 USB ports. Or maybe it's the price. While the cost of this box has been known to fluctuate, depending on which part of the world you're at, it's possible that it can be had for pretty cheap. For example, where I'm from, it's occasionally available brand new at retail for 50, so you played knifey spoony before, Australian dollars. You might expect then that for something with a price tag similar to a cheap dinner for two, that Cooler Master have cut some corners. And you'd be right. But before we get to that, there's one other obvious matter that we must address first. You may have observed already that up front here is a 5 1/4 inch bay, a feature that in most PC cases today, big or small, is no longer a thing. They're primarily used for Blu-ray and DVD drives, and you would have to be some sort of ancient fossil to still want to use one. Thanks to faster internet and cheaper storage, optical media has become about as obsolete as its printed telephone directory. Luckily, that slot can still be used with other kinds of bay devices, like card readers or fan controllers. Personally, I'm quite looking forward to using it with a device that lets me watch my movie collection. Okay. Realistically, that's a fairly niche use case. Let's not pretend that there are many other people out there who would be interested in reliving that home movie experience from the mid-2000s. Alright, so next question. Is that drive bay good for anything else?
Blockbuster video. Wow, what a difference.
You'll notice that inside there are these cutouts that you wouldn't normally find in other cases. So, with a storage drive, you're supposed to screw in these included rubber grommets, which you then slide in, and they are then held in place by friction. There's mounting points for a single hard drive or 2 SSDs up top, and there are these hooks down below for another single 2.5 inch drive. As you can see, there's room for up to 3 drives in the Elite 130. Except you'd be wrong, because on the floor you can mount another hard drive or SSD, and then there's the side bracket, which can support one more drive or even a fan. That brings the total up to 5, and that's not factoring in additional drives that can be mounted with a separate double-decker adapter, or drives that can be connected directly into the motherboard. And on the subject of motherboards, you are limited to mini ITX or the less common mini DTX size form factors. And because the ATX size power supply sits above on this protruding bracket, your CPU cooling options are a bit height restricted. There's only 65mm of clearance above the CPU, which is the perfect size for suffocating a 65mm tall cooler like this one. Luckily, there is another solution. What I have here is the Hydro Series H80i V2 High Performance Liquid CPU Cooler from Corsair. This thing looks like a miniature version of something you'd find at the front end of your car's internal combustion engine. It mounts to your CPU at this end, so it can move the generated heat to this end. Here, it'll sit between this included fan, which pushes fresh, cool air through the cooling fins, and this other included fan, which pulls the warmed up air out the other side. And because it's got such a mouthful of a name, let's just refer to it as the meatball. Bear in mind that because the full meatball takes up quite some space, Using it will mean giving up some of those scarce few storage mounting options. Oh dear. As for the space to house the rest of the PC, the process is pretty much like any other. Plug the thing into the other thing, turn some screws, all pretty routine. That is, until you get to this part. A typical feature of modern cases, especially larger ones, is that your motherboard mounts onto what's called a motherboard tray. Behind that is a gap and then a panel, typically removable so you can get to said gap. The idea is that when it comes time to do your cabling, you can thread them through strategically placed cutouts in that tray and run them in that cavity to keep them tidy and out of sight. Because the motherboard here mounts directly onto the base, there is no gap and therefore no way to keep your cables hidden. And that means getting a little creative with your runs. There are these tie down points around the edge that you can thread a cable tie through, and you can always tie loose cabling up along the top rails. But the more cabling you need, inevitably the messier it'll get. Which is one more reason not to install an optical drive, really. But if all you were interested in was watching TV shows and movies, you wouldn't really need a machine this complex. However, this being a PC that'll be used expressly for the purposes of entertainment, it would be nice to be able to play the odd game or two. And for best results there, you would need a graphics card. The 1080 Ti, that top of the line card you'll remember from earlier, was good for running most games at the max settings in Full HD back in its day. But, as you can see, that's not what I've got in here. This is the GTX 1060, a card that came out a few short years after the old headliner. Mine specifically is the cut down 3GB model manufactured by Zotac, and has less video memory and less processing power than the original. And yet, despite being crippled outcast of a graphics card, it has near identical performance to the old Ti while consuming less than half of its power. And when it first came out, it cost less than half than what this did when it was new. It's little wonder then that computing hardware doesn't typically have a long best before date. Even that 1060 is starting to show its age, and would not be well suited for newer TVs or monitors with native resolutions of 4K or higher. And yet, even when everything around it is turning old and grey, one little black box has managed to defy the odds and weather the winds of change. Maybe being cheap, simple and unassuming has given it its staying power, though other simple and cheap cases have certainly come and gone. Maybe there really are a lot of Blu-ray and DVD users still out there who need something like this. Well, that seems doubtful. Maybe enthusiasts just like PCs with meatballs. It's certainly not without its shortcomings, but for whatever reason, it's still around, and I'm certainly pretty fond of it. So for whatever it's worth, I would consider the Elite 130 to be one of Cooler Master's greatest hits.